It was nearly midnight when Greg and Laura found themselves lost. The highway had been closed for construction, and the detour led them deep into the rural backroads, where their GPS kept losing signal. The darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and almost alive. The only source of light, their car's high beams cutting through the empty stretch ahead. The air outside was heavy with mist, and the deeper they drove, the more it felt like they were leaving the real world behind. "We should have reached the main road by now," Laura said, her voice betraying a mix of frustration and anxiety. Greg nodded, his eyes flicking from the winding road to the map on his phone. The map showed nothing but blank space, a void that made Greg feel a gnawing sense of dread. A chill ran down his spine as he spotted something strange, an unmarked road on the right, one that seemed to be the only option. "Let's take it," Greg muttered, more to himself than to Laura, and he turned the wheel. The road was narrow, the trees forming a dark archway above, and everything felt wrong the moment they entered. Laura clenched her jaw, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest. The branches of the trees seemed to reach towards them, like skeletal fingers trying to pull them into the shadows. The first time they passed it, they didn't think anything of it. An old, dented mailbox, leaning at an awkward angle, and a broken-down car just beyond, rusted and forgotten. Greg squinted at the car, noting the busted windows and the way the hood was slightly ajar, as though someone had tried to fix it and given up. But then they passed it again, the same mailbox, the same car, just a mile later. Greg frowned, glancing over at Laura, who had noticed it too. Her eyes were wide, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Is this some kind of loop?" she whispered, her breath fogging up the window slightly. Greg shook his head, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "Probably just another old car. We're in the middle of nowhere, after all." But a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He didn't want to admit it, but it felt like the road was toying with them, leading them in circles, trapping them. A few miles later, the knot grew when they saw it for the third time. The mailbox, the car, and a man. A shadowy figure standing just beyond the trees, almost hidden, but unmistakably there, watching. Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her pulse quickened, and she could feel her heart thudding against her ribs. "Did you see him?" she asked, her voice trembling. Greg nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Yeah, just some guy. Maybe a farmer." He tried to sound confident, but even he didn't believe his own words. The figure had been too still, too deliberate, like he wanted to be seen. There was something about the way he stood, half concealed in the shadows, that sent a shiver down Greg's spine. Greg pressed down on the gas pedal, the car speeding up as they tried to leave the eerie sight behind. But the road seemed endless, twisting and winding with no end in sight. The GPS had long given up, leaving them at the mercy of the dark. The air in the car grew heavy, and a silence settled between them, broken only by the hum of the engine. Laura kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to see the man again, lurking in the darkness. Suddenly, Laura screamed, pointing ahead. There, on the side of the road, was the same man. This time, he was closer, his face partially illuminated by their headlights. His features were indistinct, almost blurred, but his eyes were fixed on them, unblinking. Greg's hands began to shake, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. "Turn around, Greg," Laura shouted, panic rising in her chest. Greg slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly as he swung it around, tires screeching. They sped back the way they had come, but nothing looked familiar anymore. The mailbox, the car, the man, they were gone. Instead, the road stretched endlessly, the trees on either side closing in, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the car. The mist thickened, clinging to the windshield, and Greg struggled to see more than a few feet ahead. Greg's heart pounded, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Laura clutched his arm, her eyes darting around, searching the darkness for any sign of the man. The headlights flickered, just for a moment, and in that brief darkness, Greg felt a presence. Something unseen but undeniably there, watching, waiting. A chill settled over the car, and Laura shivered, her breath catching in her throat. "What is happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the engine. Greg didn't answer. He couldn't. He felt like they were driving deeper into something far beyond their understanding, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. The road twisted again, and there it was, the mailbox, the car, and the man, standing directly in their path. Greg swerved, the car careening off the road and into the ditch. The world spun, metal crunching, glass shattering, and then silence. The airbag deployed, slamming into Greg's chest and knocking the breath out of him. The car settled. The only sound the ticking of the engine and the distant rustle of the wind through the trees. When Greg opened his eyes, the car was still. The headlights cast a dim glow on the twisted trees ahead, and Laura was beside him, unconscious but breathing. He looked back at the road, his vision swimming, and saw the man, standing at the edge of the ditch, his face now fully visible. It was empty, hollow, a void where features should have been. He lifted a hand, pointing at Greg, and a whisper echoed through the night, though no lips moved. "You shouldn't have come here." Greg's body went cold, fear rooting him to his seat. He tried to move, to reach for Laura, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. The man took a step closer, his movements slow, deliberate. Greg could see the darkness behind him, swirling like a living thing, tendrils of shadow reaching out, coiling around the trees, the car, everything. The darkness swallowed everything after that. Greg felt a sudden pressure in his head, a deep, throbbing pain that made his vision blur. He could hear whispers, countless voices overlapping, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The man was closer now, standing right beside the car, his hollow face peering in through the shattered window. Greg wanted to scream, but no sound came out. He could only watch as the man lifted his hand again, this time placing it on the car door. The metal seemed to ripple under his touch, the door warping and bending as though it were made of clay. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Greg felt something inside him give way, a part of his mind slipping into the darkness. He turned his head, his gaze falling on Laura. She was still unconscious, her face pale, a small cut on her forehead where she had hit the dashboard. He had to protect her. He had to get them out of here. With a surge of desperation, Greg forced his hand to move, reaching for Laura's shoulder. He shook her, his voice finally breaking free in a hoarse whisper. "Laura, wake up, we have to go." Her eyes fluttered open, dazed and unfocused. She looked at Greg, then past him, her eyes widening in terror as she saw the man. "Greg," she breathed, her voice barely audible. The man's hand moved, reaching towards Laura, and Greg felt a surge of adrenaline, his body finally responding. He grabbed her arm, pulling her towards him as he fumbled with the seatbelt. The whispers were deafening now, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Greg managed to free Laura from her seat, and they tumbled out of the car, landing in the cold, wet grass. He pulled her to her feet, his heart pounding as they stumbled away from the car, away from the man, into the forest. The branches tore at their clothes, the ground uneven beneath their feet, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Behind them, the man watched, his hollow face expressionless as the darkness swallowed the car, the road, everything. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of their frantic breaths and the rustle of the forest. Greg didn't know where they were going, only that they had to keep moving, had to get away from whatever nightmare they had stumbled into. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around them, the mist thickening until they could barely see a few feet ahead. Greg's legs burned, his chest ached, but he didn't stop. Laura was beside him, her hand clinging to his, her eyes wide with fear. They ran until they could run no more, collapsing against the base of a tree, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, there was silence. No whispers, no shadows, just the sound of the wind in the trees and their own breathing. Greg looked at Laura, his eyes searching hers. "Are you okay?" he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. What was that?" Greg shook his head, unable to answer. He didn't know. All he knew was that they had to keep moving, had to find a way out of this place. He looked around, the forest dark and unending, and he felt a deep sense of dread. They were not safe. Not yet. "We have to keep going," he said, his voice trembling. Laura nodded, and together, they stood, their hands clasped tightly as they stepped further into the unknown, the darkness still lurking, watching, waiting. As they moved deeper into the forest, the air seemed to thicken, the mist turning into an almost tangible presence that clung to their skin and made it difficult to breathe. The trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches twisting overhead, blotting out the sky. It felt like they were walking into another world, a place that was hidden from the light of day. The ground beneath their feet was soft and uneven, and every step seemed to take more effort than the last. Greg kept his eyes forward, refusing to look back. He could feel the presence behind them, the dark force that had swallowed the road and the car. It was following them, creeping silently through the forest, and Greg knew that if he looked back, he might see it. Something he wasn't sure he could handle. He squeezed Laura's hand, trying to offer her some comfort, but he could feel her trembling. "Just keep moving," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't sure if he was talking to Laura or to himself. The whispers had faded, but the sense of being watched hadn't. It was as if the darkness itself had eyes, and Greg could feel its gaze on the back of his neck, cold and unrelenting. They stumbled through the forest, their progress slow and arduous. The ground was littered with roots and fallen branches, and more than once, Greg nearly lost his balance. Laura tripped, her foot catching on a root, and Greg caught her just in time, pulling her back to her feet. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, and he could see the exhaustion in her face. "I can't. I don't know if I can keep going," she said, her voice barely audible. Greg shook his head, his own body aching, every muscle screaming for rest. "You have to," he said, his voice firm. "We have to keep moving. We can't stop here." He looked around, his eyes scanning the dark forest. There was no sign of the man, but Greg knew he was out there, somewhere, waiting for them to let their guard down. They pushed on, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with every passing minute. The mist had become a thick fog, swirling around their legs and obscuring the ground beneath them. The branches of the trees seemed to reach for them, their skeletal fingers brushing against their faces and arms. Greg felt like they were walking through a nightmare, a place that didn't belong in the real world. After what felt like hours, they stumbled into a small clearing, the fog parting just enough to reveal a patch of open ground. Greg let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his knees buckling as he sank to the ground. Laura collapsed beside him, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, they just sat there, their bodies aching, their minds reeling from the terror they had experienced. The clearing was quiet, the fog swirling around the edges, and Greg allowed himself to believe, if only for a moment, that they might be safe. But then he heard it, a faint rustling, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Greg's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the darkness. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it was getting closer. "Laura," he whispered, his voice trembling. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. Greg reached for her hand, pulling her to her feet. "We have to keep moving." Laura nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. She was exhausted, her body on the verge of collapse, but she knew Greg was right. They couldn't stay here, not when whatever was out there was still following them. They stumbled out of the clearing, back into the dense forest. The fog was thicker now, the air heavy and oppressive. Greg could barely see a few feet in front of him, the world around them reduced to shadows and shifting shapes. He held Laura's hand tightly, guiding her through the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. The rustling grew louder, and Greg knew that whatever was following them was getting closer. He could hear its footsteps now, soft but deliberate, crunching on the fallen leaves and twigs. He glanced back, his eyes straining to see through the fog, but there was nothing, only darkness. "Just keep moving," he whispered, his voice shaking. He could feel Laura's fear, her hand trembling in his. He wished he could tell her that everything would be okay, that they would find a way out of this nightmare, but he couldn't. He didn't know if there was a way out. Suddenly, The ground beneath them gave way, and they tumbled down a steep embankment, their bodies rolling and crashing through the underbrush. Greg hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. He lay there for a moment, dazed and disoriented, his vision swimming. He could hear Laura beside him, her soft groans of pain. "Laura!" he gasped, struggling to sit up. He reached for her, his hand brushing against her arm. She was alive, but barely conscious, her eyes half closed, her body limp. Greg pulled her closer, his heart pounding in his chest. They had to keep moving. They couldn't stop here. He looked around, his eyes scanning the dark forest. The fog was still thick, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. There was no sign of the man, but Greg knew he was out there, somewhere, waiting for them. He had to get Laura to safety. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. With a grunt of effort, Greg pulled Laura to her feet, her body leaning heavily against him. He stumbled forward, his legs barely able to support their weight. The ground was uneven, the underbrush thick and tangled, but Greg pushed on, his determination the only thing keeping him going. The whispers started again, soft at first, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. But they grew louder, more insistent, the voices overlapping, speaking in that strange, unintelligible language. Greg felt a chill run down his spine, his body tensing. He knew they were close, that the darkness was closing in on them. "Come on, Laura," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We have to keep moving." Laura stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Greg, her gaze unfocused, her face pale. She nodded weakly, her body swaying as she tried to walk. Greg held her tightly, guiding her through the forest, his heart pounding with every step. The whispers were deafening now, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Greg could feel the presence behind them, the cold, unrelenting gaze of the man watching their every move. He knew they were running out of time, that they couldn't keep this up much longer. Suddenly, the fog parted, and Greg saw something up ahead. A light, faint and flickering, barely visible through the trees. His heart leapt in his chest, a surge of hope washing over him. Maybe there was a way out. Maybe they could escape this nightmare. "Look," he said, his voice hoarse. "Do you see it? There's a light." Laura lifted her head, her eyes squinting against the darkness. She saw it too, a faint glimmer in the distance, and a spark of hope lit in her eyes. They stumbled towards it, their bodies aching, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The light grew brighter as they approached, cutting through the fog, guiding them forward. They broke through the trees, stumbling into another clearing. The light was coming from a small, old cabin, its windows glowing with a warm, flickering light. Greg's heart raced, a sense of relief washing over him. Maybe they had found safety, a place where they could rest, where they could be free from the darkness. They approached the cabin, Greg's legs barely able to support him. He reached for the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. The door creaked, the sound echoing through the quiet night. They stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin enveloping them, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive forest. Greg closed the door behind them, his body sagging with exhaustion. He turned to Laura, her eyes wide as she looked around the small room. It was simple, with a few pieces of old furniture and a fireplace crackling with a warm fire. For the first time since they had entered the forest, Greg allowed himself to believe that they might be safe. But then, he heard it, a soft whisper, coming from the shadows in the corner of the room. Greg's heart skipped a beat, his body tensing. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the cabin. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and Greg felt a chill run down his spine. Laura looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Greg, what is it?" He shook his head, his eyes locked on the shadows. "I don't know," he whispered. The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt suffocating, the walls closing in around them. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, and Greg realized with a sinking feeling that they hadn't escaped. The darkness had followed them, and it was still watching, still waiting. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, shifting and growing, and Greg felt his breath catch in his throat. The man was there, his hollow face emerging from the darkness, his eyes fixed on Greg and Laura. He lifted a hand, pointing at them, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. "You shouldn't have come here." Greg's body went cold, fear gripping him. He grabbed Laura's hand, pulling her towards the door. "We have to go," he said, his voice shaking. Laura nodded, her eyes wide with terror, and they stumbled out of the cabin, back into the cold, dark night. The forest loomed before them, the fog thicker than ever, the darkness closing in. Greg held Laura's hand tightly, his heart pounding as they ran, the whispers following them, the man's hollow gaze burning into their backs. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to keep moving, had to find a way out of this nightmare. The darkness was relentless, the forest endless, and Greg knew that they were running out of time. But he refused to give up. He had to protect Laura, had to find a way to escape. He pushed on, his body aching, his mind reeling, the whispers echoing in his ears. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, the man watched, his hollow face expressionless, his presence a reminder that they were not alone, that the darkness was always there, lurking, waiting, watching. They had entered a place where the rules of reality no longer applied, and there was no escaping it. The forest was alive, the darkness a living thing, and Greg knew that they were trapped, caught in a nightmare from which there was no waking. But still, they ran, their hands clasped tightly, their hearts filled with a desperate hope. Because as long as they kept moving, as long as they refused to stop, there was still a chance to escape, a chance to survive, a chance to find the light, somewhere beyond the darkness.